The room was cold that night, not from the air, but from the silence that followed his words. He stood there, chest tight, voice barely steady, and said it out loud for the first time, that he was going to change everything. And they laughed. Not the kind of laughter that comes from joy, but the kind that cuts, that dismisses, that buries hope before it even has a chance to breathe. He had been nobody for so long that being nobody felt like a second skin. Every morning he woke up in a studio apartment where the walls were so thin he could hear his neighbor's alarm clock before his own. The paint was peeling in the corner by the window, and the faucet dripped no matter how many times he tried to fix it. The water would hit the porcelain sink in a rhythm that haunted his nights. Drip, 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 like a metronome counting down the seconds of a life going nowhere. He worked a job that didn't know his name, just his employee number. 40 hours a week, sometimes 50, sometimes 60 when they needed extra hands and didn't want to pay for them properly. He did work that didn't matter to anyone, not even to himself. His hands would ache by the end of the day, not from labor, but from the weight of doing something that felt like nothing. He'd clock out, walk past his supervisor without a word, and drive home in a car that rattled every time he hit 40 miles per hour. He'd come home, heat up something frozen in a microwave that only worked on half power, sit on a couch that sagged in the middle like it had given up on life before he did, and stare at the ceiling until sleep finally pulled him under. That was life. That was all it had ever been. A loop, a prison made of routine. But something inside him refused to accept it. It wasn't loud at first. It was a whisper, barely audible beneath the noise of everyday survival. A small voice that said, "This can't be it. There has to be more." He didn't know where it came from. Maybe it was the memory of who he used to be before the world taught him to shrink. Maybe it was the dreams he'd had as a kid, back when he believed anything was possible. Back when he'd stand in front of the bathroom mirror and rehearse acceptance speeches for awards he'd never won. Maybe it was the way his father used to look at him before the disappointment settled in, back when his dad still thought he might become something. Whatever it was, it wouldn't leave him alone. And one night, after another long, empty day that felt identical to the 1,000 days before it, he decided to listen to it. He started small. He bought a notebook, the cheapest one he could find at the dollar store, the kind with a flimsy cover and paper so thin you could see through it. And he began writing down ideas. Ideas for a business. Ideas for a product. Ideas for a life that looked different than the one he was living. Ideas that felt impossible but somehow necessary, like breathing. He didn't tell anyone at first because he knew what they'd say. He'd heard it before, from his family, from old friends, from everyone who'd ever looked at him and decided he wasn't built for anything more than what he already had. So he kept it quiet. He worked on it in the margins of his life, late at night, when exhaustion should have pulled him under but his mind wouldn't stop racing. Early in the morning before the sun came up and the world woke up to remind him of his place in it. He taught himself things he didn't know. He read books he couldn't afford, standing in bookstore aisles for hours, memorizing passages before the employees asked him to leave. He found free courses online, clicked through videos with titles like How to Start a Business with No Money and The Fundamentals of Digital Marketing. He watched them until his eyes burned, until the blue light from his laptop screen gave him headaches that lasted for days. He learned about business, about marketing, about supply chains and customer acquisition costs and profit margins. He learned about how to build something from nothing. And slowly, painfully, like a photograph developing in a dark room, an idea began to take shape. It took him 6 months to build the first version of it. A product, a service, something he believed could help people, could solve a problem he'd lived with himself for years. It wasn't perfect. It was rough around the edges, held together by hope and duct tape and code he'd written at 3 in the morning when he could barely see straight. But it was his. And for the first time in years, He felt something close to pride. He wanted to share it. He wanted to tell someone. He wanted to stand in front of people who knew him and say, "Look, look at what I made. Look at what I can do." So he did. He gathered the people closest to him, his family, a few old friends, people he thought would understand because they'd known him before life had beaten him down. He invited them over on a Saturday afternoon. He cleaned his apartment, tried to make it look less like a prison cell and more like a place where dreams could live. He set up his laptop on the coffee table, pulled up his presentation, and waited for them to arrive. They came in slowly, skeptically, like they were doing him a favor just by showing up. His brother walked in first, glanced around, and made a joke about the peeling paint. His friend came next, already distracted by his phone. His mother arrived last, carrying a casserole she'd made because she couldn't come anywhere empty-handed, worry already etched into her face. He stood in front of them, heart hammering in his chest so hard he thought they could hear it, and he showed them what he'd been working on. He explained the vision, the plan, the possibility. He told them about the market research he'd done, the prototype he'd built, the customers he believed were out there waiting for something like this. He showed them the website he'd designed himself, the branding he'd created, the social media strategy he'd mapped out. He told them he was going to quit his job, go all in, and build something that mattered. He said he was going to change everything. His voice was shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of finally saying it out loud, finally making it real. And they laughed. Not everyone, but enough. Enough that the sound of it echoed louder than any encouragement. His brother shook his head and said, "You're dreaming, man. This isn't realistic. You know how many people try to start businesses and fail? Like 90%. You really think you're going to be in the 10%? His friend leaned back, arms crossed, and said, "You really think you can compete with people who actually know what they're doing? People who went to business school? People who have investors?" His mother, the one person he thought might believe in him, looked at him with worry in her eyes and said, "I just don't want you to get hurt. Maybe you should keep your job. Just to be safe. You've got benefits. You've got stability. Why risk all that?" And just like that, the air went out of the room. The thing he'd been building in secret, the hope he'd been nurturing like a fragile flame, felt small again. Foolish. Naive. Childish. He tried to respond. He tried to defend himself, to explain why this was different, why he was different. But the words got stuck in his throat, and all he could do was nod and say, "Yeah, maybe you're right." They left not long after, his mother squeezing his shoulder on the way out, his brother saying, "Just think about it, okay?" His friend didn't say anything at all, just waved and walked out the door like the whole thing had been a waste of his Saturday. He sat alone in his apartment after they left, the silence heavier than it had ever been. The laptop was still open on the coffee table, his presentation still glowing on the screen, but now it looked different. It looked foolish. He stared at it for a long time, and then he closed the laptop, put it away, and sat in the dark. He thought about giving up right there, about going back to the life he knew, the one that didn't ask anything of him, the one that didn't risk anything because it had nothing left to lose. He thought about showing up to work on Monday and pretending none of this had ever happened, pretending he'd never dreamed at all. But he couldn't. Because even though they'd laughed, even though they'd doubted, even though every logical part of his brain told him they were right, that small voice inside him refused to be quiet. It said, "They don't have to believe. You do." And so, sitting there in the dark, in an apartment that felt like it was closing in on him, he made a choice. He decided that their laughter didn't get to be the end of his story. It got to be the beginning. He stopped talking about it. He stopped seeking validation, stopped looking for permission, stopped trying to convince anyone that he was capable. He put his head down and got to work. He kept his job for a few more months because he needed the money, But every moment he wasn't working, he was building. He'd wake up at 5 in the morning, work on his business for 2 hours before his shift started. He'd eat lunch at his desk, laptop open, responding to emails, tweaking his website, reaching out to potential customers. He'd come home at night and work until midnight, sometimes later. He stopped going out. He stopped watching TV. He stopped doing anything that wasn't directly related to building what he'd promised himself he would build. His friends stopped inviting him places. His family stopped asking how he was doing. And he was okay with that. Because for the first time in his life, he was working towards something that mattered. He launched it quietly, without fanfare, without announcement. He put the website live on a Tuesday morning, hit the publish button, and sat back and waited. The first week, nothing happened. No sales, no traction. Just silence. He checked his analytics obsessively. 0 visitors, 0 conversions, 0 everything. The second week was the same. And the third. He started to wonder if maybe they were right. Maybe he was chasing something that didn't exist. Maybe he'd wasted 6 months of his life on a dream that was never going to become real. But then, slowly, something shifted. One person bought his product. It was a small sale, barely enough to cover the cost of the materials, but it was real. He stared at the notification email for 10 minutes, reading it over and over, making sure it wasn't a mistake. Then another sale came. Then another. Then 5 in one day. Then 20. He started getting messages, people thanking him, telling him the product had solved a problem they'd been struggling with, that they'd been looking for something exactly like this, and couldn't believe it existed. It wasn't a flood, but it was real, and it was enough to keep going. He reinvested every dollar he made back into the business. He improved the product based on customer feedback, refined the messaging, learned from every mistake. He started running ads, testing different audiences, figuring out what worked and what didn't. He worked harder than he ever had in his life, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Because for the first time, the work meant something. Every sale felt like validation. Every positive review felt like proof that he wasn't crazy, that the voice inside him had been right all along. Months passed. The numbers grew. Slowly at first, then faster. What started as a trickle became a stream, then a river. He hit his first $1,000 in revenue, then 10,000, then 50,000. He quit his job, not in a blaze of glory, not with a dramatic speech where he told his boss what he really thought. He just walked in one morning, gave his 2 weeks' notice, and left. His boss barely looked up from his computer, just nodded and said, "Okay, good luck." And that was it. 10 years of his life, dismissed in 2 words. But he felt it, the weight lifting, the possibilities opening. He rented a small office space, nothing fancy, just a room with a desk and a window that looked out onto a parking lot. But it was his. He hired his first employee, a young woman who believed in the vision as much as he did. Then his second, a designer who made his brand look professional. Then his third, a customer service rep who could handle the growing volume of inquiries. People started noticing. Blogs wrote about him. Podcasts invited him on. Customers became advocates, sharing his story, spreading the word. The thing he'd built in silence was starting to make noise. And then, a year and a half after that night when they laughed, he hit a milestone he'd once thought impossible. His business crossed 7 figures in revenue. 7 figures. $1 million. He sat alone in his office the night he saw the number, staring at the screen, unable to process it. He refreshed the page 3 times to make sure it was real. He looked around the empty office, at the whiteboards covered in strategies, at the desks where his team worked during the day, at the window that no longer looked out onto a parking lot, but onto a view of the city skyline. And he thought about the peeling paint in his old apartment, the job that didn't know his name, the people who told him he was dreaming. He thought about every late night, every rejection, every moment he wanted to quit. And he realized something. They hadn't been wrong to laugh. Not really. Because from where they stood, what he was saying did sound impossible. But they weren't standing where he was. They didn't see what he saw. They didn't feel what he felt. He didn't tell them right away. He didn't post about it on social media, didn't send out a triumphant message, didn't call his brother or his friend or his mother to say, "I told you so." He let it sit with him for a while, let it become real. But eventually, word got out. People started talking. Articles were written. His name started appearing in searches. And the same people who had dismissed him began reaching out. His brother sent a text. "Hey, heard things are going well. Proud of you, man. We should catch up." His friend called, suddenly interested in collaborating, in getting involved. His mother told everyone she knew that her son was a success, that she'd always believed in him, conveniently forgetting the conversation in his apartment where she'd told him to play it safe. And he felt nothing. Not anger, not bitterness, not even satisfaction. Just a quiet understanding that their belief had never been the point. His had. Their validation, the thing he'd once craved so desperately, meant nothing now because he'd already given it to himself. He'd already proven what needed to be proven. Not to them. To himself. The business kept growing. He expanded into new markets, launched new products, built a team of people who believed in the vision as much as he did. He moved into a real office, the kind with glass walls and conference rooms, and a view of the city that made him feel like he was on top of the world. He bought a home, not a mansion, but a place that felt like his, where the faucet didn't drip and the walls didn't echo with someone else's life. He started getting invited to speak at events, to share his story with audiences full of people who were where he used to be. And every time he stood on a stage, looking out at hundreds of faces, he thought about that night in the cold room when they laughed. He didn't tell the story with bitterness. He told it with gratitude. Because their laughter had taught him something crucial, that the only belief that matters is the one you have in yourself. But success didn't erase the struggle. It didn't rewrite the past. There were still hard days, still moments when doubt crept in, still failures that stung. He launched products that flopped. He made hiring decisions that turned out to be wrong. He faced competitors who were bigger, better funded, more experienced. The difference was that now he knew he could survive them. He'd already survived worse. He'd built something from nothing. Not because he was special, not because he had some gift others didn't, but because he refused to stop. Because he chose to believe in the possibility even when no one else did. And that choice, repeated every single day, had been enough. Years later, he found himself back in the town where it all began. He was there for a speaking engagement, a small event at a local college. As he walked through the familiar streets, everything looked smaller than he remembered. The buildings, the stores, the streets themselves, all of it had shrunk somehow, or maybe he'd just grown. He passed the building where his old apartment had been. It looked the same, worn down, forgotten, like time had stopped there the moment he left. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, and felt a strange kind of peace. That version of him, the one who had lived in that apartment, who had dreamed in silence, who had been laughed at, he was still in there somewhere, not gone, just transformed. After the event, as he was packing up his things, a young woman approached him. She was nervous, fidgeting with the strap of her backpack, her eyes darting around like she wasn't sure she should be there. She told him she'd been working on an idea for 2 years, that she hadn't told anyone because she was afraid they'd laugh, that she didn't know if she had what it took. Her voice was shaking, and he could see himself in her so clearly it almost hurt. She looked at him with wide, hopeful eyes and asked, "How did you know you could do it? How did you know it would work?" He smiled. Not the confident smile of someone who always knew, but the quiet smile of someone who didn't. He looked at her, really looked at her, and he told her the truth. I didn't know. I still don't know. Nobody does. The people who succeed aren't the ones who know. They're the ones who decide that not knowing isn't a good enough reason to stop. She nodded slowly, and he saw it. The same spark he'd once felt. The same stubborn refusal to accept the life that had been handed to her. He knew she'd be okay. Not because success was guaranteed, but because she'd already made the most important choice. She'd decided to try. He left that night thinking about all the people who were where he used to be. Working jobs they hated. Living in places that felt too small. Carrying dreams they were too afraid to speak out loud. He thought about how many of them would give up, not because they weren't capable, but because someone laughed. Because someone said no. Because the world told them they weren't enough. And he wished he could tell every single one of them what he'd learned. That the laughter doesn't matter. The doubt doesn't matter. What matters is what you do in the silence after. What matters is whether you let it stop you or whether you let it fuel you. Because here's the truth they don't tell you when you're starting out. When you're at the bottom looking up at a mountain that seems impossible to climb. Everyone gets laughed at. Everyone gets doubted. Everyone faces moments when the world looks at them and says, "You can't." The difference between those who make it and those who don't isn't talent or luck or privilege. It's the willingness to keep going anyway, to work in the dark, to build in silence, to believe when belief feels impossible, and then, one day, to look around and realize that everything has changed. Not because the world gave you permission, but because you took it. Not because someone believed in you, but because you believed in yourself when it mattered most. He thought about all the nights he'd sat alone in that apartment, wondering if he was wasting his time. All the moments he'd wanted to quit, to give up, to accept that maybe they were right and he was wrong. All the times he'd felt like a fool for believing in something no one else could see. And he realized that those moments, those dark, lonely, doubt-filled moments, weren't weaknesses. They were the foundation. They were the price. They were what made the victory mean something. Because anyone can succeed when everyone believes in them. Anyone can keep going when the path is clear and the support is strong. But to keep going when no one believes, when the path is invisible, when every logical reason tells you to stop, that's different. That's the mark of someone who's willing to pay the real price. And the real price isn't money or time or effort. It's the willingness to be misunderstood, to be doubted, to be laughed at, and to keep going anyway. He drove back to his hotel that night, the city lights flickering past his window, and he felt grateful. Not for the success, though that was nice. Not for the money or the recognition or the validation that had finally come. He felt grateful for the struggle, for the nights he'd wanted to quit, for the people who'd laughed. Because without all of that, the victory would have felt hollow. It would have felt like luck. But this felt earned. This felt real. And as he pulled into the parking lot, turned off the engine and sat in the quiet darkness of his car, he made himself a promise. He promised that no matter how big his business got, no matter how much success he achieved, he would never forget what it felt like to be at the bottom. He would never forget the kid in the apartment with the peeling paint and the dripping faucet. He would never forget the laughter, the doubt, the silence, because that was where it all began. That was where he learned who he really was. So here's what I want to know, and I mean this sincerely. What have they told you that you can't do? What dream are you carrying in silence right now, afraid to speak it out loud because you think they'll laugh? What version of yourself are you hiding because you're worried it's not realistic, not practical, not possible? I want you to tell me in the comments below. Write it down. Make it real. And while you're at it, let me know where in the world you're watching from. Because wherever you are, whatever you're facing, whatever mountain you're staring up at, you're not alone in this. There are millions of us out here, fighting the same fight, carrying the same doubts, building in the same silence. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of your own struggle or gave you even a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, you can do the thing you've been too afraid to try, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and leave a like. Not for me, but for you. As a reminder that you heard this today, that you felt something, that something shifted inside you, even if just a little bit. Because that shift, that tiny moment of belief, that's where it starts. That's where everything begins. And remember this, because it's the most important thing I can tell you. Silence always comes before glory. That long, hard stretch when no one believes and nothing seems to be working. When you're building in the dark and questioning everything. That's not the end. That's not failure. That's not proof that you should quit. That's just what comes before. That's the price of admission. That's the test that separates those who really want it from those who just think they do. So embrace the silence. Work in it. Build in it. Let it make you stronger. Because on the other side of that silence, on the other side of the doubt and the laughter, and the nights when you can't sleep because you're terrified you're making the biggest mistake of your life, that's where glory lives. That's where transformation happens. That's where you become the person you were always meant to be. They laughed when he said he'd change everything. And now he has. Not because he was special. Not because he was lucky. Not because he had advantages others didn't. But because he refused to let their laughter be the end of his story. He decided it would be the beginning. And you can make that same decision. Right now. Today. In this moment. The question is, will you?